Hello, everyone. My name is Mercy, and welcome to Talkback Blog, a blog exploring questions and debates around activism, international development, digital media, and digital technologies. Talkback Blog consists of 4 master students, Lauren, Kasia, Samuel, and myself, pursuing the Communication for Development course at Malmo University. From now till the end of October 2021, each of us will be sharing blog posts around activism in and through new media. Today, Lauren and myself will be interviewing Kate and Samuel about their experiences at the Friday for Futures demonstrations, which they attended in the past week. That was on 24th September 2021. Samuel attended in Gothenburg in Sweden, and Kasia attended in New York in the United States. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Mercy. So maybe before we dive in, just a little bit of background on Friday for Futures. And quoting from their website, which is fridaysforfuture.org, in case you don't have the link, the group is a youth-led and organized movement that began in August 2018 after 15-year-old Greta Thunberg and other young activists sat in front of the Swedish parliament every school day for 3 weeks to protest against the lack of action on the climate crisis. And I think many of us have seen those really powerful images of Greta when she was sitting outside of the parliament in those early days, as well as more recent images of her, heading out on a sailboat across the Atlantic Ocean, getting ready to address world leaders. And it's really just a testament to the powerful movement that she now leads as an international youth climate activist. And according to the website, the group's most recent demands are to keep the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, to ensure climate justice and equity, and to listen to the best united science currently available. The most recent action that we're going to talk about today and that our peers here attended was organized by the group post-COVID in particular, took place on the 24th of September, that was last Friday, in locations all around the world. And they were using the hashtag uproot the system, whereby the group was calling for a global climate strike to demand intersectional climate justice. And 2 of our peers, as we mentioned, Sam and Kasia, attended in Gothenburg, Sweden, and in New York, in the US. So we're going to speak to them today about their experience. And with that, let's take it over to you guys. So welcome, and we're really excited to discuss your recent experience with you. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves.
I can go first. Hey, I'm Sam, and I'm a freelance copywriter slash scriptwriter slash theatre play writer sometimes, working predominantly with business to business clients in Gothenburg, Sweden. Which is also where I'm based, and I'm currently studying the Master's Communication Development, which is opening up a whole new world for me of development, which I'm hoping to pursue more in the near future.
Thanks so much, Sam. And I am Kasia. I am a communications specialist, and I've been working in international development for most of my career. I'm currently based in New York City, but I am from South Africa, which is where I also started working in development. And quite a bit of my work kind of cross-cuts with youth activism and youth advocacy. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
Thanks, guys. 2 really interesting different backgrounds. I think it'll be some interesting perspectives you guys will bring to the discussion today. So let's get started with the very first question, which is, what interests you most with the movement Friday for Futures work and mobilizations? And in particular, what drew you to participate in this most recent global strike? You guys can decide who would like to go first.
I can start. I can jump in. I think I think for me it was the fact that the movement is predominantly youth-led, and that it grew out of the determination of young activists. For me personally, I became much more engaged in climate issues after I became a parent. About three years ago now. So since then, I've been thinking a lot more about my children's future, So I think it is super interesting to see what the young generation, the youth of today are doing to draw the world's attention to this pertinent climate crisis. So for that's how I came to this movement and why I loosely follow them. Yeah.
That's a really interesting perspective, Sam. I think for me, it's a little bit different. I guess probably my first connection to this was through work. As I mentioned, some of my work touches on seeing how young people are active in their communities and trying to bring about change. And obviously, this was quite an incredible instance because it also just really took off around the world. Young people in different places saw what was happening in Sweden and what Greta started, and started taking up this action in their own countries in many different ways. I think it wasn't an option for everybody to like not be able to go to school or to physically protest, but really young people all around the world took up this action, took up the message and adapted it into their contexts. And I think it's really incredible to just see, the scale that this grew to. And I think with regards to the most recent activities, I was really interested to attend to kind of see how the movement was doing after COVID. Well, we're still in the COVID pandemic, but here in the United States, especially in New York, a lot of the restrictions around movement have lifted. So this was one of the first times that people were coming together in the climate movement on one of these physical demonstrations. So I was interested to see that. And I was also in New York at the march 2 years ago when Greta Thunberg was here. So I was also interested to see how it compared to that.
Thanks, guys.
Well,
And
thank you.
I just wanted to ask one quick sort of sub question, especially because Sam, you mentioned, I think you both mentioned like the youthful nature of the movement. I'm just curious, based on the participation that you saw in New York and in Gothenburg, what was the makeup of the crowd? Was it a lot of youth participating, or was it I mean, obviously it's not scientific, but based on your perception of who you saw and.
In Gothenburg, yeah, that's interesting because in Gothenburg, I was also expecting. I had an idea of there's going to be a lot of young people here, and actually it was a real mix. Mm-hmm. It was the turnout. Well, I think we're going to get onto this on a later question, but I think the turnout was quite poor, really, in Gothenburg, to be honest, compared to the last one I attended, which was a couple of years ago. But yeah, there was a lot of it was a real blend of ages. It wasn't I didn't look around and think, wow, there's a lot of young people here. There were a lot of young people there, but they weren't flooding the area. It was I saw a lot of middle-aged people to pensionists. So yeah, there wasn't. Yeah, I was expecting actually more young people to be there.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of New York, I would say it was predominantly young people, kind of high school, university age. But there were also younger children who came with their parents, and also older generations who I imagine have been involved in both climate but also community activism here in New York for a long time. So there was quite a good spread of ages, I would say.
I think it's really inspiring to see, that young people can really mobilize, not just among themselves, but almost everybody. So that's why I was interested in that question. But let's see, Mercy, we can go on to the next question. Thanks for letting me jump in with a.
All right, Kasia and Samuel, I wanted to ask you, was this your first time participating in the demonstrations? And if not, how do you compare? If this was, not your first time participation, how do you compare it with previous actions?
I'm happy to go first this time. So this was not my first time. As I mentioned, I did attend the 2019 huge mobilization that took place ahead of the climate summit that was happening, that the UN Secretary General had organized. And also previous to that, there were local New York City-based activations and school Friday strikes by young people here in New York City that would even take place outside the UN. So I had attended some of these demonstrations before, but I would say as kind of more as an observer rather than kind of an active participant. And in terms of how it compares, I mean, I think all of these activations have been very different. The 2019 activation and march when Greta was here was absolutely massive. I don't remember now how many thousands of people took place, but when we went to the location where the march was due to start, when it actually started, it took, I think, about half an hour before the place where I was, where we could actually even start to move. That's how many people were there. But it's also, I don't think, necessarily like fair to compare and also use size as the only measure of success, because that was a march that was taking place ahead of a massive UN summit around the General Assembly. You know, there were loads and loads of additional people. Greta had sailed here on the boat that Lauren mentioned earlier. So it was a very different type of context. And I think that's something interesting to reflect on. And also to think about in terms of like, how do we measure the success of movements, and what are these types of things, you know, what does it mean, how many people showed up on the streets. So yeah, that's some of my experience. Sam, over to you.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, the turnout. This wasn't my first. I participated in another march also a couple of years ago. So this was my second time. The first protest was a lot bigger. It was a lot. It felt more dramatic. There was a march in the first protest that I went to, where we marched down. There's a big long street in the middle of Gothenburg. And it just had a sense of, it had more of a sense of urgency for me then somehow, and it just felt a lot more, the atmosphere was a bit more tense. This, yeah, like I said, this year was a smaller turnout. There was probably only about 150 people there, maybe maximum 200. And I'm not sure if the pandemic had something to do with that, if people were still a little bit adamant to kind of get together in big groups. This one felt lighter in some way. It felt there was dance. It actually had like a mini festival feeling, like there was some dance music playing. There was a truck that was brought in. I think the truck was connected to the group Extinction Rebellion. So there was music. There was even a choir, a local choir that was singing protest songs, which was really, it was really nice. But it had this very kind of like jovial, kind of like little bit light feeling about it. Even though you could see people, and some of the people I spoke to care a lot about the issue. And it was all situated in one square. There's a square in the middle of Gothenburg city. Where usually marches start there. So it was, it felt very different, but the messaging was still very similar. And I think Kasia, what you were talking about with success, that's a very interesting point. What the success rate of protests, should we be looking at the scale of things? But I guess if we're thinking about now, since Greta started this movement, I mean, even though this was quite small in Gothenburg, how many of these events are going on worldwide? I mean, that speaks volumes that this movement is happening around the world. So definitely, I think that's an interesting point to reflect on. Even though there wasn't that many people, the movement is big, and it's still there and being covered in mass media, and it's very, they do have a very visible presence on online. So yeah.
Thank you guys. That's really good. I also attended the online version, and I don't have any previous experience, and there are about 66 people overall that came in from the beginning. By the end of it, there were about 44, which was also very interesting to note. And they had, rooms, different rooms this was a Zoom webinar. So they had different rooms, one for mental health, addressing mental health, one for another organization presenting their work and encouraging more activism from the youth. They were inviting more youth to join them. And yeah, there was a third one also about the environment, climate change, and so this was also interesting to observe. But the online version had about 60 people, 66 people attending. So that's interesting. Lauren?
Yeah, I'm just listening. I think it's really interesting, your experiences. I was not able to participate myself, whether online or in person. So, and I haven't participated in any before. So it's just really interesting to hear the differences, how it was. And interesting as well to hear, kind of about the difference in size, that maybe it's been a bit smaller, the atmosphere is a bit different this time, maybe a bit more muted, a kind of COVID, maybe having an effect on that, not super clear. And actually that made me think, I wonder really what are the challenges kind of in mobilizing movements in this current time? Because if really the most effective type of, activist movement protest, and raising awareness is through physical manifestation, then obviously that's been impossible or very difficult. And even now that things are opening up, people might be quite reluctant because 2 years, you start to change your habits of how you do things. And I think that leads maybe really well into the next question, because the next question I wanted to ask a bit more about the use of digital media in their movement. So to what extent, I mean, as far as you could see and as far as from interacting with this movement, are they integrating digital media and activism and development? Because those are kind of the three themes of what we're studying. And do you see any opportunities or any challenges? And from your experience at the protest, to what extent were people there engaging with digital media during the protest? So I'll let you guys.
I can start with this one. Yeah, I think like most groups today, Fridays for Future do have a very active social media presence. That they're across most of the social media channels. Their website is also used to promote their events. It is also used seems to be used as a hub of information. And I saw that you can also download, which is interesting, you can download a Google Doc, which can then be doctored to, if you're then creating your own little mini protest or another sort of protest, you can use that document to kind of align it to something that you're also passionate about, or that you want to kind of protest about. The people that I spoke to, some of the young people that I spoke to at the protest, I asked them about this, their activity online, and how much they follow the group, and how they see the importance of being the digital presence, being online versus on site, and most of them acknowledged that it was the impact of digital media in getting people together. They all acknowledged that it was really an important tool for them to communicate to their friends and families that they were going to go to this event, and it was a good way to kind of let people know what you stand for. But all of them also said that they absolutely believe that you have to be there on the day to show your support, and that camaraderie that you get from being there at the event was really crucial to actually try and drive through real development. I think I got the impression, like from some of the young people that I spoke to, that they all understood that it was more about not just getting likes, you know, they understood the importance again of actually turning up and showing that you're there, instead of just passing on and sharing stuff online. I actually asked them, one teenage girl said to me, kind of like no nonsense like reply, that, you know, when I asked her, like, you know, do you think this is an important event, and she was like, you know, of course we do, because we care about our planet and our future. And it was like, the way she said it just felt like, it felt very familiar as well, that I've heard other people. She was around 13, maybe 14. It felt a very common response to the climate crisis. It's almost like, of course, you know, they why wouldn't they be thinking about it? It's almost all they've known from the get-go. So I think that was quite interesting. Yeah, over to you, Kasia.
Thanks, Sam. I think so many interesting things to unpack in this question. I think just listening to all of you talking as well just made me think of a few things. One is I've been reading this book called Twitter and Tear Gas, which kind of looks at digital media in the role of various movements. And some of the things that the author speaks about kind of struck me. One was around how movements that come together kind of in this digital age and that often kind of bring very large groups of people together at the beginning rather than later on in their life as a movement, how they sometimes struggle to find new tactics to keep the energy and keep the movement going, because obviously change takes a long time, and you know, it's not feasible to do a physical protest or a march every single week. So how do you keep people engaged? And I think then, you know, in the situation we've had in the last 2 years with the COVID pandemic, I think that really forced a lot of movements and organizations to relook at their tactics. And I think in the case of Fridays for Future, it's really interesting to see how they took their activities, you know, to the online only space, and they had their kind of online demonstrations where encouraging young people to post with their signs, and Greta was doing that herself as well from her house. And then they did all kinds of other things, again, to keep the energy and the momentum going. But I think that kind of question of like tactics and digital media is an interesting one, like an interesting lens from which to examine various movements over time. The other thing that struck me, which is also talked about in the book, is this kind of idea that you know, people online are connected very much through kind of what is termed weak connections, and then versus, like, you know, family and friends, those are our strong connections. But of course that's a little bit of a myth, because we have both kind of weak and strong connections, and they operate in different ways in the online space. And one of the groups I approached and talked to on Friday in New York, I asked them kind of what motivated them to attend, and they all pointed at a young woman on the stage, and they said, "Oh, she goes to our school." So it wasn't kind of just oh, we heard about this online, but there was very much that role of these other types of connections and relationships that we have in our lives that were playing a role. And in terms of looking at digital media and how it was being used, I mean, there were obviously a lot of people taking photographs, and there were some people that I saw live streaming, which is a little bit tough because, you know, when you have a lot of people in a tight space, internet connectivity goes down very quickly. I had a lot of trouble communicating while I was there and sending photos and video clips, but there was definitely that, which I think you'd expect pretty much anywhere these days, people with their phones. But I also found that people were, you know, sitting and listening to the speeches, and that it was kind of very, I guess, analog or traditional in that way. But the last thing that I'll say is that there was also an integration of things like you know, people mentioning crowd funding platforms, or platforms like Venmo and PayPal in the context of mutual aid. There was one speaker talking about an activist who was in kind of need of funding. The activists didn't have work at the moment, and the woman who was speaking on stage gave like the Venmo and PayPal and Cash App handles where and encouraged people there in attendance to also donate funds directly, which I think is a whole nother interesting aspect, which we won't have time to go into today. But that was like a different type of digital platform that was also being integrated into the gathering.
I should add as well that there was a similar vibe going on in Gothenburg in terms of the digital tools that were being used. There was, of course, people were taking pictures with their cameras and phones, and that some of the people I spoke to were tweeting, but at the same as Kasia was saying, but there was also these traditional old school kind of ways of with the placards, and there was there was a group of teenagers that had brought lots of pieces of card and paints for people to make their own placards on the day. There was like I mentioned earlier, I think there was a choir there, and there were speakers, and yeah, I had the same feeling that people were documenting it and using the digital presence to kind of say that they were there, but at the same time they were engaged with what was going on the ground in a very traditional way, with holding up their signs and talking to people and listening. So it was a blend of those tools. I was going to ask you, were there other organizations there that were also like, for example, we had in Gothenburg, there was Save the Earth were there, and there was a couple of other organizations. I can't remember who they were now, but there was definitely, it felt like they had joined forces somehow, or taken the opportunity to, there's a protest, we'll be there as well, and we'll also give out our message. Was that the case in New York as well?
100%. I mean, all different kinds of groups, from international ones that also have chapters in different places to far more local groups, including groups that are kind of, New York City based activists, but not necessarily like their primary focus is climate, but, their work and climate and environmental activism intersects. So yeah, and I mean, I think that's really great that this is, not just, it's not about a particular group per se, but it's also an opportunity for different groups and organizations to come together under a shared message.
Yep.
You guys made so many interesting points. I don't even know if we could unpack all of them, but I think especially these last points of, kind of the traditional protesting sort of being still there, and that being the way that people are mainly engaging with it, and using the media, the digital tools more to document and share and sort of spread information, I think is really interesting. And also just but interesting what you said, Kasia, about bringing in other types of digital platforms to support the movement, and I think all of that kind of, and also the way you tied it to the reading that we have for the Twitter and tear gas, because I was just reading that section as well the other day, and I think it's interesting to see that I think this group was one that maybe grew with close ties in person, but at the same time grew globally with a lot of weak ties, right? And so maybe and then with COVID sort of thrown into that, maybe what we're seeing is a little bit of this is a long-term issue that requires a long-term movement, a long-term activism, and it's not necessarily slowing down, but maybe there's we need to adapt a little bit, and how can they keep their numbers up, and is that the measure of success, or tying in all those points we've discussed so far. So I think that was really interesting, what you guys had to say. And now I'll pass it over to Mercy, because we have another question.
All right, this is my last question to you, which says, which burning issues, related to climate change were of interest to participants of the demonstrations, especially participants with whom you interacted? Were there any burning issues that people, wanted to discuss with you?
Do you want to start?
Either of you can go, yeah.
I can, but also you're welcome to, Sam. I would say that the New York March was really kind of focused on communicating an intersectional message. So this is specifically reflecting on the speakers. So when the march ended, there was a whole lineup of different speakers in New York, and they actually started like just a few minutes after we arrived. So I'd only just managed to speak to a few people, and then the speeches started. But there was a very strong message right from the get-go of focusing also on the issues of indigenous people, not just in the United States, but around the world, and how indigenous people in so many places have actually been the stewards of our land or environment for a very long time. There was a lot of focus on anti-racism and how the climate movement needs to be more inclusive and also focused on anti-racism. So those were some of the big messages that were coming across from the perspective of the speakers who were invited and who were talking. And I think the last one, which is a little bit different, was there was I guess kind of differently to what you mentioned, Sam, I would say that the mood in general and the message was quite frustrated in New York. I think a lot of the young people reflected on how, a lot of them were in a kind of a similar location 2 years ago, and they really haven't seen much change, and that they're tired of being kind of engaged very tokenistically by decision makers, that a lot of decision makers kind of are like, oh, look, these impressive young people, pat on the back, but then that they aren't really taking their messages seriously, and that they aren't implementing the kind of policies and actions that need to be taken to, really have any kind of hope of stopping kind of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So yeah, those were some of the reflections. There was definitely references also made to COVID, particularly also on like the personal impact that it has had on the activists, and how hard it has been on a lot of people, and changed them in so many different ways, that they're not the same young activists who were here two years ago.
Yeah, I can jump into, I can comment on that. There was a similar, I felt that frustration as well in Gothenburg. And there was like the #1 placard that was being held up was change the system, not the climate. So there were, and a lot of people, the people that I spoke to seemed to generally agree that it was a systemic change that was needed, rather than, it was that was the thing that they were much frustrated most with, that like Kasia was saying, that time had gone on, and what you're still seeing these same issues, and people it's business as usual in many ways, and a lot of the young people seem to have jumped on that and are really pissed off about that. And in terms of locally, what Gothenburg was focusing on, some of the issues were, one of the main issues was deforestation, and not just deforestation, but how the importance of forests, Scandinavian forests, and also connect to the indigenous people. One of the speakers was a guy, it was a Sami, which is one of the indigenous tribes in Scandinavia, and he was taking up issues, talking about the importance of the forest for his family's lifestyle, economically, culturally, symbolically, what forest meant. There was another speaker that was focusing on the fact that a lot of people think, especially in Sweden, that there's just endless amounts of woodland, that over here we have forests everywhere. And what she brought up, an interesting point, was that, okay, we have a lot of these forests, but a lot of them are cultivated. A lot of them have been grown specifically for manufacturing purposes, and that affects the biodiversity of these areas. So even though we have a lot of these forests, that they're not, you know, then ideally they're not the best kind of forest you could have. A lot of the general, even though there were these talks, the general issue was still climate change, and the young people that I spoke to, that was on the top of mind. And they understood that there were so many other branches to it, things that climate change was affecting. Yeah, but it was generally, yeah, the young people that I spoke to it was all about changing the system, and you know, we've still got to work towards changing climate. So yeah.
Right. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Very insightful. Lauren, anything you would like to add?
No, that was just really interesting to hear what the priorities were, and also to hear, you know, that the messaging was really consistent across locations, and, you know, with the sort of overall, like what they sort of promote on their website, what is the uproot the system, you know, was their hashtag, well, change the system, you know, these are all kind of within the same messaging, and them on their website, you know, referencing that they want to work on, or one of their demands is intersectional, you know, climate justice. So that these protests are really, you know, bringing in all the different issues, indigenous issues, racism, gender, you know, putting it, really looking at how all of those social issues, you know, kind of combine, and how climate issues affect those different issues as well. So I think it's really interesting that it must be a very strong movement, and we know it is, but to see that they you know, in Europe, in the US, really across the world, they're managing to have like a really consistent messaging, but still kind of localized to the specific concerns of the place. So, you know, in Sweden, as you mentioned, with the issues of the woodlands and the Sami people, I think really interesting, but nothing really to add. So thanks for sharing that, guys. Yeah, so many thanks for your insights and your experiences on the demonstrations. And it was really enriching. And I think we've all learned a lot today just about the movement, but as well as, you know, its intersection with development, with digital media. And I think there's so much more we could have discussed, but I think that's a good point to stop now. And I'll just hand it over to Mercy for last words.
Yeah, and a big thank you to our viewers and readers out there. Please let us know your thoughts and questions and views in the comment section of our blog. We are eager to learn from our readers and viewers. Very grateful to Kasia and Samuel for their insightful narratives and insightful experiences at the demonstrations, the Friday for Future demonstrations, to help us all to get a good picture of what went on in two different locations, and, you know, the mood around it, the frustrations of demonstrators, and what they really want to change as in the system, which they believe would in turn lead to climate change eventually, since it is we humans who are causing these, you know, this destruction to our planet. Again, thank you to everyone. Thank you all. And see you, readers and viewers, in the comments section. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.